Times. It leads with a plea from dozens of British jihadists disillusioned with fighting in Syria to be allowed to come home. The group says that they would be willing to enter de-radicalisation programmes and submit to surveillance.
Russia's business world is bracing itself for a fresh round of sanctions over its alleged role in the Ukraine crisis. The Moscow Times warns that the sanctions will isolate Russia and inflict lasting damage.
Front page of the Financial Times is dedicated to the actions of the European Central Bank. Yesterday, it cut interest rates to a record low, surprising markets. The euro had its largest one-day decline since late 2011 in response.
A US court has ruled that BP acted with gross negligence and willful misconduct in the Gulf of Mexico oil spill disaster. The business section of the Daily Telegraph tells how BP could face fines of up to $18 billion.
In Japan, the Japan Times leads with a very 21st century threat, cybercrime. It's reached a new record of around $17 million in Japan this year, with banks and regional lenders the main targets.
The China Daily looks at smart chopsticks that can sense whether a meal has been cooked in fresh or illegally recycled gutter oil. Oh, just
sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? Anyway, we're joined by Mark Davies, CEO of strategy consultancy Camberton, to talk us through some of the papers, and we'll get to the greasy story at the end in just a moment. But let's first of all start with this front page of the Times today. A really interesting story, isn't it, about some jihadists who've got in touch with organisations here in the UK saying, we want to come home.
Yeah, they've got in touch with King's College London saying that they're disillusioned. On the face of it, it's hard to have that much sympathy for them in a way.
They're fighting in Syria,
but they're fighting in Syria. This is just not Islamic State. I mean, I think that people will probably read this and immediately equate them with what's happened in the most recent weeks, whereas actually this is about people who went out to Syria to fight against Assad and found that it wasn't quite what they thought it was going to be. They thought they were going on a naval crusade. They've decided that it wasn't what they were expecting, and they want to come back and be de-radicalised. On the face of it, of course, that's very good news. But as I say, in the context of what's happened in recent weeks, I think most people will look at this and say, well, it's pretty hard to have sympathy for these people. How naive can you be in the first place? On the other hand, anything that reduces radicalisation has got to be a good thing.
Well, they are now with a group affiliated to Islamic State. So, yes, although they are in Syria and they went out with the thought of fighting Assad, they have ended up in this rebel group. And it does come down, as you say, to a question of, was it naivety?
Well, maybe that's the thing, that showing that you get sucked in from one thing that seemed like this brave cause, fighting Assad, part of the Arab Spring, as they might have seen it. Actually, it's not that you get drawn into what we've seen more recently, which is just barbarity. If that message can get across to more people, then it's a good thing that their disillusionment is showing through. I don't think people will read it like that. I think people on the whole will say, it's very, very hard to have sympathy with this. I mean, I must say, when I saw the headline, my reaction was, poor loves.
Also, as well, of course, you know, the UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, is keen to make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for these people
well,
to
indeed.
return.
I mean, they won't be back in the country at all.
So we'll watch that space very closely.
Moving on to the Moscow
Times.
Times, our top story on business today, and the tightening of sanctions against Moscow. An analyst I was just talking to described them as a sanction level 3 light, although these ones might not be quite so light because they are moving into target areas like energy, moving into these smaller banks, so not just the state-owned bigger banks, really cutting off their access to Western funding, which is crucial to the Russian economy.
It is. It's crucial because they've got a lot of debt that they have to repay in the second half of this year and in the first half of next year. $100 billion is what needs to be refinanced over the course of the next 6 months. And if they don't have access to Western capital, they won't be able to do that. We should point out, of course, I think you mentioned earlier that this is not a Russian viewpoint. This is a newspaper that's for expats in Russia, the Moscow Times. So whether the Russian populace is necessarily looking at this and thinking about it in the same way as this is coming across in this paper, I'm not absolutely sure. Of course, the Western viewpoint is that if Putin wants to stop this from happening,
pretty scathing, saying
it is absolutely scathing. The Western viewpoint is that if Putin wants to stop these sanctions happening, it's very simple for him to do so. He just has to stop what he's doing currently in eastern Ukraine. What the Russians view, the way that they view the world, is obviously very different from the way this is coming across in the Moscow Times.
And of course, this all could change by the middle of today if there is a ceasefire brokered between Ukraine and Russia on the crisis in
Indeed.
Ukraine.
I mean, if the Russians don't want their businesses to have capital cut off from them, it is entirely within their power to stop that from happening. They just need to broker a ceasefire today.
Yeah.
Now, Financial Times, Draghi intervention on rates, bonds startles markets. There's a picture of him there smiling grinning from ear to ear.
It's a Cheshire Cat smile,
It's kind of a bit of a bizarre photo, but anyway. Give us your take on this change. I mean, we were expecting the ECB to do something, but not necessarily this.
Yes, I think that the reason that the markets reacted as they did is because there was talk that the ECB would wait until later in the year to see what the impact was of what they'd done in June. Having said that, I'm surprised to some extent that the markets were surprised, because for the last week there has been talk about the fact that Draghi needs to do something significant.
I think they perhaps thought that maybe quantitative easing might be on the agenda then, as opposed to the other
measures.
But
that sort of takes it even further. He could have done more. I think also part of the problem here is that it is seen that the ECB is running out of options as to what it can do. Basically, all it has left after this is buying back government bonds. And so it's seen to be ever more restricted in the action it can take. With interest rates as it is in Germany, short-term interest rates now in negative territory. So they're increasingly short of room for manoeuvre, and I think that is what's spooking the market.
Draghi has most definitely paved the way for quantitative easing, hasn't he now? That was made quite clear.
Yeah.
Yes, let's look at
there wasn't complete agreement, of course, and that's another thing which perhaps has worried the markets a little bit. There was a clear majority, says Draghi, but you'd hope that this kind of decision comes with a unanimous viewpoint, and it hasn't had one.
Yes. Looking now at the Daily Telegraph business section, another big story, of course, Draghi dominating that front page as well, but also the story at the top, BP facing another $18 billion fine. This story just won't go away, will it?
It won't. I think this is the difference between what is right in law and the way people see perception, because what is being argued by BP is that thresholds to show that they have been negligent haven't actually been passed. Again, I think that the vast majority of people would look at what happened in Deepwater and say, well, they were clearly negligent. Of course, to fight it in law in order not to have the massive fines and massive liabilities which are now exceeding what BP have set aside, they need to argue the case on a very strict legal basis.
How bad is this for BP? The shares sunk like a stone.
Yeah.
I mean, if it is found to be grossly negligent,
well, the shares are still.
Can BP remain?
The shares are only 2/3 now what they were at the peak, and if they now have 18 billion, they've set aside 3.5 billion for civil liability.
There's a big difference.
So there is a big difference. They've already spent 40 billion, I think, in total, or had set aside that amount. They're going to breach that in turn. But I think from a perception perspective, this is just terrible for their reputation. I always say to people, I do a lot of reputation management, I say to people, it's not a question of what you say, it's what you are seen to do. And what they are seen to have done is a lot worse than the law is telling them happened.
Let's briefly look at the Japan Times now. Cyber theft, it strikes fear into the heart of businesses and individuals.
Well, all of us, I think.
Yeah. And it's hitting a new record in Japan.
It is, although I must say I was surprised that the number's smaller than I thought. It looks big when it's in yen, 1.8 billion, but that's $17 million, so what? That's 10 million pounds. It's a smaller number than I thought. I think the rate of growth is the frightening part. Because that's more in the last 6 months than the whole of last year, and the whole of last year was in turn a record. So I think the growth rate is rather alarming. I must say that £10 million in cyber fraud, I'd probably take that.
Okay.
Now we're going to have to leave it there, Mark, because we want to talk about these smart chopsticks that can tell safe food from bad. Would you use a pair of those?
I'm not sure we necessarily want to know what's in the food. It tastes nice, but that's as good as it gets.
Anyway, I'm sure there'll be a seller. Thank you, Mark, for your time, and thank you too. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.